Okay. The previous example involving the disease and the probability of having a disease given a positive test was an example of where we applied Bayes' rule, what's called Bayes' rule, although we didn't actually call it by name. So now we're going to derive Bayes' rule formally. So Bayes' rule is a combination of what? It's a combination of the multiplication rule and the law of total probability. Combines the multiplication rule with the law of total probability. Okay. So suppose we have mutually exclusive and exhaustive events. So they're exhaustive of all possible events. And let's let E be an event. And we think of E standing for evidence. So the idea is we have a bunch of different cases, and then we observe some evidence. And what we're interested in is we're interested in the probability of each case being true, of each of the cases, given the evidence. And what Bayes' rule is, it tells us how we actually update the probability of each case given the evidence. So in the previous example, what we were interested in was, what's the probability of having the disease? The disease is the case. You either have the disease or you don't. And the evidence is the positive test. So we observe a positive test. What's the probability of having the disease given the positive test? We calculated that. So it's the probability of the case that we're interested in times the probability of having observed that evidence given that the case is true. And we have to divide by the value over all possible cases. So the numerator here is the multiplication rule, and the denominator is the law of total probability. This is Bayes' rule. Technically, you don't really have to memorize Bayes' rule. I do not have, believe it or not, I do not have Bayes' rule memorized because I can always rederive it from the multiplication rule and the law of total probability. So I don't need to memorize it. And the more you try to memorize, the more likely you are to mess something up. So I try not to do that. So this is Bayes' rule. And this is widely used, and we're going to have an example of how Bayes' rule applies in the context of the law next, and in particular in the context of the O.J. Simpson trial is an interesting example that we'll discuss next.